Welcome to week 4 of the Summer Sugar Quilt Along. I thought this week that I would get my quilt out to show you one of the blocks in the finished quilt. My quilt has been washed because we used it as a picnic quilt last summer, so it's nice and crinkly. This is what I have used on the back. A lot of you guys have asked about this. This is a coral print from my Ahoy Mermaids fabric collection. This would also be great with one of the florals from the summer picnic collection on the back, which is what I would have loved to use, but I had to make this with advanced yardage from Riley Blake, and there just wasn't enough. But this would be beautiful with one of those large scale floral prints on the back. This week I am making the cherry block. The cherry block features snowballed corners, which we've covered in past videos, and then the leaves are made using kind of an adaptation on a flying geese block. And then the thing that's unique to this block that we haven't introduced yet is the fabric strips. I'm calling them biased tape strips. They're not biased. They are not cut on a 45-degree angle. I'll mention that a couple times in the video. I don't mean to be repetitive, but I know that can be confusing. So I did go ahead and mention that a couple times. Those are sewn to the block as the construction process goes, and I have just top stitched them down the edge to secure them in place. After they're quilted, you can see they kind of just blend into the quilt. If you are someone that is talented at hand applique, definitely recommend you could hand applique that down if that's something that you want to do. So let's get started creating this block. There are 3 of the cherry blocks in the quilt. Let's start piecing the cherry blocks. The instructions for the cherry blocks are on page 14 of your pattern. After you've cut all your pieces out, the first thing you want to do is create the leaf portion of the blocks. So for the leaf blocks, we're using a technique similar to what we've done in the past. It's kind of the same technique as creating a flying geese block in the fact that you're going to stitch along a diagonal line, trim, and flip. So I've got half of it already done here. I've stitched a diagonal line across the center of this square, laid it on top of my leaf piece. Excuse me, sorry, allergies here are just terrible lately. Keep getting frogs in my throat. Trim that, press it up. I've already pressed this side so you can see what to do next. Take one of your squares of fabric that you've drawn the line on, lay it on top of the piece with the line going towards the center, just like the other one, and stitch on the line, trim, 1/4 inch on the outside of your stitching line, and press. And when you're done, you will get a piece that looks like this. There are 2 of these pieces in the quilt block. Go ahead and create both of them. This piece of fabric should stay close to 2.5 by 6 because it's what we started with. If you want, you can just do a quick double check if anything needs to be squared off. Sometimes when you press your fabrics on a diagonal, they have a tendency to stretch a little bit, but this one looks pretty good. After you have done the leaf blocks, the next thing to do is the cherry portion of the blocks. And those blocks are created using the snowball method. You are just going to sew a square to each of the 4 corners of the strawberry print for the cherry block. Trim 1/4 inch on the outside of the line, flip it up and press, and when you are done, it will look like this. I want to give you a tip too. You notice that this has a tendency to kind of flip up a little bit. What I like to do with these pieces is I will press them on my ironing board face down, and then I will take something heavy like a book, or usually I use a book. Like if I have a book that I've always got sewing books around, and I'll take the book and I'll just put the book on top of it and leave that there for a few minutes, and it kind of helps a little bit with this tendency that that piece has to fly up. After you've sewn the leaf and the cherry portions of the block, you're ready to start assembly. You have a right and a left section on this block. So here I have the right section. You have got your sewn leaf piece We're going to sew a rectangle to that side and press it, and then sew these pieces on the top and bottom of that piece. It is outlined on the pattern which piece is which. And refer to the pattern because I don't want to tell you the wrong thing, because I always get my measurements mixed up when I start talking. Then you are also going to create a left leaf section, and that one is only 3 pieces, so one to the side, and then you are going to sew another one to the bottom. Press all of that. Then the last thing you need to do is on both of your cherry pieces, you need to sew one piece, one rectangle to each side. Now these are sewn to opposite sides, but since my fabric is not directional, there's no up or down, so just sew it to any of the 4 sides. If you're using directional fabric, definitely go in and double check that you are sewing it the correct way. And then on one of the pieces, which is the left cherry piece, you're also going to sew a piece to the bottom. Proceed to that point, and then I'm going to show you how to create the bias that we are using for the stems. And actually it's technically not bias because it is not cut on a 45-degree angle, but I'm going to refer to it as bias because what the tool we're using is a bias tape maker, and that's just what people usually call it. Let's go over the steps to make the bias. And like I said before, I am referring to this as bias tape. This fabric piece has not been cut on the bias. It is just a 1-inch strip of fabric. For this step, I like to use a pin. I think it helps to feed it through a little better. And I am using a bias tape maker that is, this one's 12 millimeters. It's a 1/2 inch. So what you want to do, and let's see if I can do this on camera, is I always cut an angle to start. I just think it helps feed it through a little better. Get it through. And you want to pull it. See how that's twisted? That's not what you want. We're going to do that again. And that's why I think sometimes having the okay, there. So you can see now, look how that is laying in there flat. And if you don't want to lose that much fabric, you can go ahead and move the bias tape maker back. That's a mouthful. If you're new to this, I would recommend going ahead, and if your ironing board lets you place a pin in this end. And then it's just, the easiest way to do this is one long motion. So place your steam iron down and then move it. And I noticed that if I hold the bias tape maker at a 45-degree angle, that it seems to give it a little bit more like resistance so that I get a cleaner line. So there, you can see that. I usually come in afterwards and press it again just to get it nice and flat. After you've made your bias, you're ready to attach it to your block. If you don't want to buy a bias tape maker or do this technique, you can also use, 1/2-inch green ribbon. Just make sure that the ribbon won't melt as you press it. So a cotton ribbon, because you're going to press your block, and if you use like a polyester ribbon that melts, then it's not going to be good. All right, we are going to do the right side of this cherry block. The bias is actually getting attached to this portion of the block, but we need the cherry here so you can kind of see where it's going to line up. So what I want to do is, so one thing to note with this is if I were to put this all the way over here, where it looks like it lines up, it's actually not going to go there because you're going to sew a 1/4-inch seam in it, and so when this gets folded over, it's going to move a little bit. So instead of trying to kind of aim for the edge, I kind of just try and aim for the center-ish point. So I like that starting there. And then this side, you want to leave a 1/4 inch over here so that you can still sew your seam allowance. So as you can see here, it's overlapping the leaf a little bit in that corner. So I'm going to cut this. There's a couple ways to do this next step. I like to use a glue pen. You can also use Elmer's school glue. If you don't want to use a glue pen, just use lots of pins. But I noticed that the glue pen, which obviously needs to be adjusted, all I'm doing is sticking lint to it right now. Oh, very sticky glue pen. Line this back up again. Kind of shooting for about the center of that cherry and lay it in place. What I'll do next is take this to my iron and set that glue with some heat. Then we're going to stitch down both sides of the stem to secure it in place. Let's do the other block. There's a diagram in your pattern to refer to this. This is the left side so that you know what you're doing. All right, same thing over here. We're going to start it kind of in the center and then making sure I leave a 1/4 inch right there, glue it down and attach it and sew it to this portion using just right on the very edge. I'll go ahead and top stitch mine and show you, and then I'll trim these pieces even. I have stitched to that right down the edge. You do want to make sure you get as close to the edge as possible, because when you either quilt this yourself or send it to your long armer, you don't want anything for the presser foot of the long arm machine or your sewing machine to get stuck on. So go ahead and sew that as close as you can. Next, just going to assemble the block. So this piece to this piece to this piece. Sew them both together, so you'll have one long seam down the center. Then the last step is to sew your 12.5 inch wide piece to the bottom of the block. If necessary, when you're done, trim and square it up to as close to 12.5 by 12.5 as you can. Repeat this process 2 more times so that you create 3 cherry blocks for the quilt. And next week we will move on to creating the bee block for the quilt.